Lord, we just thank you for the fellowship that we can come together, break bread and and Lord, we ask you just to bless the word tonight. Lord, each one, with their eyes and their ears and our heart, let's open up to your Holy Spirit and receive what the Pastor has for us. We give you all the glory, we give you all the praise.
Amen.
Amen. Mm-hmm. Sure.
I took over as our townhouse president the 1st of May. Our treasurer, what did I say? The president of your treasurer the 1st of May, and things were in really bad shape. And Susan's been helping me a lot. We've been trying to get things going and trying to get money collected and stuff like that. Well, in June, when we had our board meeting, our president said, would anybody mind if I said a prayer? And we all were like, oh, that would be great. I can't tell you how much money and how successful we've been since that meeting. And it's been such a blessing, and just, it shows you how much prayer, what prayer can do for you. And it's been amazing. I just wanted to share that.
It's good. Well, we're going to look at one of the questions y'all asked was like a day in the life of a disciple. I thought that would be interesting to get started. And so that's what we're going to look at tonight. And we're going to go over a few things. And maybe there'll be something here that just kind of set your imagination, back during that time. Even looking at the picture here, the clothes they wore, what they were taking with them, just your everyday life. They didn't have telephones or cell phones, or couldn't pick up the phone and call an Uber to come and take them to their next location. And these boys didn't even have donkeys or camels. So basically they did all of their travel by foot, and they covered a lot of miles. And so we're going to kind of look at it. One of the first questions that I asked myself was, I was kind of interested in how were the disciples called by Jesus? One of the things is that Jesus personally basically handpicked the 12. And they were out working their normal jobs. Whenever he went and he saw Peter, he was on his boat. And there's a lot of things that we could dive into as far as looking at them on a personal level and according to tradition and history, and basically just staying with what the Bible says. But we know that Peter, among the 12, was most likely the oldest of the 12. We'll get into that here in a little bit. But even in the Bible, it tells us that he took care of his mother-in-law, so therefore we know that he's married. He also had his own business, a fishing business, which was a successful business. He also had 2 houses. And because he had one that was kind of like out of the way on the outskirts of town, and then he had one down by the ocean. So he had some oceanfront property. So anyway, Peter was probably, he was doing well. But the thing about it is that whenever Jesus called them and asked them to follow him, they gave up all of that. They walked away from it. And so it was a sacrifice. And you would think, how could you do that? How could you give up your business and leave your family to follow a guy that you knew absolutely nothing about? There had to be something about Jesus' personality that drew them in. And of course, I believe that. I believe that it was the Holy Spirit within him. I believe that it was the presence of God about him. I believe that Jesus had a way of presenting himself that was attractive I'm sure that you probably met somebody that you probably didn't know all that well, but you were just kind of drawn to that personality. You felt like you had maybe a kindred spirit, or you had things in common, or you just liked the way they talked. I've met people like that throughout my life, but I found that was, just off the top of my head, some things that were interesting. And so we're going to kind of look at it and hear what the Bible talks about. And Mark 1, 16 through 20, Simon, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, they were all fishermen. And so the Bible tells us that they dropped their nets and followed him. Now, y'all correct me here. Peter and Andrew were brothers? Or no?
Yeah.
And James and John were brothers. And James and John's was known as the sons of thunder. Okay? So they had their boats. They had their fishing business, if you will. And whenever Jesus came to them, and one thing that I might add here is that James, I believe it was James and John, they were actually at this time disciples of John the Baptist. They were helping John the Baptist baptize people in the Jordan for a short period of time, but they were actually affiliated with John the Baptist. And then, John the Baptist, whenever he baptized Jesus, if my memory serves me, is when that he told James and John the Baptist, when Jesus came to be baptized by John and James was helping John the Baptist baptize people in the Jordan. And John the Baptist often preached about the coming Messiah, and that he was his forerunner, that he was preparing people for such a time as when he would come. And then when Jesus came and John the Baptist baptized Jesus in the Jordan, is when he told John and James to follow him, to go with him. And Jesus invited them, of course, but then John the Baptist encouraged them to follow him. So all these guys left their businesses behind. The only one that I know that actually that was married was Peter. I don't know if the others were or not. Y'all may know that. I don't really know that, but the only one that the Bible tells us that was married was Peter. So anyway, they leave their businesses, and then in the Gospel of John, Jesus found Philip the next day, and he told him to follow him. And Philip then brought his friend Nathanael, which was Bartholomew, to meet Jesus. And then they went out on the mountainside, and all these people started coming out, and they were listening to Jesus. This is when he was first starting to speak publicly. And so Jesus spent the entire night praying, and when the morning came, he called all of his followers together. This big crowd. Now the guys that the four he had already asked to follow him, and they were with him, or the six of them. And so then from that point where the main crowd was at, he specifically chose and appointed the 12 men, and the other six came from that crowd, if you will. So he designated them as apostles, which means the sent out ones, and he gave them authority to preach and to heal the sick. So basically, Jesus pretty much handpicked all of them. And if you want to know what I think that Jesus was praying about on the mountainside, was going to be the men that he chose. Because these men that he chose would be the ones that would turn the world upside down for the glory of God. So, a day in the life of Jesus' disciples was grueling, very unpredictable. It was entirely centered around community because they were in the community. Okay? They didn't live in monasteries or in churches, or which there was none at that point. There were temples, but you didn't live in them. And they didn't have classrooms. anything like that. So they lived pretty much just out in the open, and which is kind of cool. And if you watch them, the series The Chosen, you will see gives a great depiction of how that they live. They would go out and they'd make a campfire, and this is where we're going to be. And a lot of times they camped right outside of a town, and they would go into town. Jesus would make his public speeches or whatever the case may be, and then they would come back, and they may be there for days, in this particular place, and then they would move on to the next one. And so they lived this nomadic life. They just lived out under the stars, if you will. And so, but it was interesting, as we're going to find out, what took place during that day. Okay, so here they are just living out on the countryside, and here's the teacher, which is Jesus, the rabbi, and the students. They woke up early, often sleeping outdoors or on a boat, or crowded into a home of people who would support them. But early on, right when Jesus chose the 12, they weren't shown great hospitality. It wasn't until Jesus performed is actually been his second miracle. Word got out after he turned the water into wine, which was his first miracle. But then after that, when he started healing the sick, that's when he really started getting a reputation, and doors started opening for him. But in the early beginning, there was no supporters. There was no hospitality as far as people inviting them to come into their house. Well, if I were guessing, I would say it would be within 6 months to a year. I'm only guessing. There were some things that they went through. I think that, during, and what we'll see here in just a moment, but this whole time, it was on-the-job training. From the very moment that they grouped together as a group, Jesus and the 12, it was on-the-job training. And there were conversations that they would have. But then there were times that was specifically set aside for teaching and learning. And it's really cool the way that Jesus did it, because they would go, and we'll get into that here in a minute, but they would go throughout the entire day. And Jesus may go in and speak to people, and he was the head talker, if you will. He was the leader of the group. Everybody else was observing how that he handled people, the way that he spoke, how that he spoke, his mannerisms and things like that. But there would also, Jesus was watching them. And he was watching how they handled certain things, how that they handled people, how that they approached people, how they started a conversation. And he never corrected them when they did something wrong during the day. The correction came in the evening when they were all together and by themselves. And to me, I think that's a sign of a good teacher, is that let them do what they feel like that they need to do. And you don't correct them in front of people, but you wait and correct them in private. And then you make those suggestions, say hey, this is really what you should have done. And maybe try this. This will work better for you. So they relied heavily on hospitality of local villages, and that's later on. And on mornings when there was no food that was given to them, they walked through grain fields plucking heads of wheat, and they rubbed it in their hands. I don't know if y'all have ever done that, but and then they ate it raw. Being out in Oklahoma for as long as we were out there, there's lots and lots of wheat fields. And I had actually went out there one time, and we were working right beside one. I mean, you could walk right over to the wall and there's a wheat field. And so I actually, I had heard of this. And so, but you got to do it when the wheat's about ready to get harvested. Green wheat don't work. But when it's dry, you can go over there and you can rub it together, and you can eat it. And anyway, I won't suggest it, but I would just want to, it's kind of like the dog food thing. I'm just curious. It isn't going to kill the dog, so it probably, I know that it's not fit for human consumption, but I just wanted to try. So And I did. So ha ha.
There's one section right here where we talk about those lost and grandchildren. In my mind, I'm thinking, this is Jesus. Why did they have to open grandchildren? I think we all just to get something to eat,
Yeah.
He's laid it on people's hearts to, work hard and stuff. I mean, people donating, feeding them and stuff like that. God always laid on these people's hearts to take care of the disciples. But now we're going for grandkids. But to me, it's a teaching lesson the same way he does us. He does us, he does them the same way.
Yeah.
This was something to teach them humility and what, that he provides, even though it's just what you need. And so many of us, so many times, we cut full of brass.
Yeah.
God give me this, I ain't gonna worry about it, he's gonna always give me. But yet, there are times he has to make us be rules that he told us, he said, okay, you're gonna scratch for it this week.
Yeah. Well, they definitely had to scratch for a lot. But they also got to witness some of God's greatest miracles. But that's a good point. So the bulk of the day was spent on the move. And, how many of y'all walked down a dirt road, a dusty dirt road when you were kids or last week? I remember my mom would one of the last things that she would say to me right before she would go to bed is that, don't you forget to wash your feet. And it was like, and I'm just saying, we didn't take baths every day, maybe every other day, and especially in the summer, because we were usually in the river. And so that was counted as a bath. And the thing about it was, the place where we went swimming, we stashed out soap. And so we could go down there and we could get in the river and we could wash and everything. And I would a whole lot rather do that than go sit in the bathtub, because I always thought sitting in the bathtub, you just sit in your own dirt. But anyway, I was so glad that one time, it was after I left home, that we actually had a shower. I took a bath underneath the water hose more than anything, probably. But anyway, I can only imagine, the dusty roads. And this is another thing, is why that it talks about washing feet in the Bible so much. It wasn't just a sacrilegious religious thing, but it was something that they did. One of the things that whenever you would go and you would visit someone in their home is that the host would come over and wash your feet. And you would, 9 times out, if I remember correctly, you didn't wear your sandals in the house. They had a place for them sitting by the door, and there was always a wash basin and a rag there that you could wash your feet. And so, it was just because you were walking barefooted down dusty, dirty roads, Yes, but they had a sealer that went over those floors. Yeah, they made their own sealers. I used to tell you what it was, but they had dirt walls as well, a lot of them. But if you notice, they would put this type of sealer over them, and it didn't make dust. So it was sealed. And most of the time on the floors, they had rugs, like carpet, but they would have rugs and that's what they slept on most of the time. So they managed, this is some of the things that they did. They would manage the crowds, because they was always pushing in. And this is after Jesus worked some of his miracles. He became more and more popular. And so Jesus is a rock star, right? And so the word's spreading. He's kind of the modern day Billy Graham, if you would. And so people are hearing about it. And then the people were coming around him, flocking toward him. And then one of the things was that the disciples had to do is that they had to be a part of crowd control. They were bodyguards basically, because everybody wanted to touch Jesus, And so, and then we learned from the feeding of the 5,000, which he fed the 5,000, then there was 4,000, and there was other times when he had groups that would come out and they would feed them. And then the disciples had to go out and put them in groups. line them up, get it organized. So here you are, you got 12 men here, you're trying to organize thousands of people. You know, if you think about when they fed the 5,000, you know, it wasn't just, and that's 5,000 plus men and or plus women and children. So there's an estimated, I've read where there would have been an estimated 8,000 to 15,000 people. So regardless of the number, that's a lot of people. Okay. So they were spread out over several acres of land. And so what they had to do is that they had to go out and put them in groups. Okay. Kind of put them in a grid, if you will. And then they would come out and they would serve that little square of people. But they had to organize that and to do it properly. I mean, some of you ladies know, like whenever we have dinners here and things like that, it's just like this. It has to be organized. Somebody, it's not just, okay, let's put the pot of beans here in the middle and everybody comes by and gets a scoop. But even if you did that, it's semi-organized. So these guys had that job of doing that. So they had to communicate among themselves, okay? And how many of you understand that if you have 12 people, I don't care if they're men or women or even a mix, there's somebody within that group that's going to have a gift of organization. There's somebody within that group that is probably going to take the lead. And they're going to discuss, and there's probably people in that group until you get to know each other is going to butt heads. Okay, well, no, I think we ought to do it this way, or they ought to do it that way. So anyway, they did it. And how they did it is a miracle within itself, as far as I'm concerned. Tried to feed 15,000 people, or even 10, or even 500 out in the middle of the day, you know, in a field, and yet they did it. And so it was a good thing. Of course, we all know that Judas Iscariot managed the money box. He was their treasurer. And they would be people that after they got to know Jesus and they got to know, basically heard about the group, that they would come in and they would give them donations. Those donations was to help them to get to the next town. That was to help them to buy food and also to give the money to the poor. That was the two main reasons why that they gave Jesus donations or gave them money, was so that they could buy food for themselves and also give money or food to the poor. And so basically after that, in the afternoon, when they were not actively working, the disciples were observing. They stood by as Jesus engaged in public debates, which would be interested. They healed people in the synagogue. Remember, Jesus had gave them that authority when they accepted the apprenticeship to come underneath him as their rabbi. And they preached to thousands. They were constantly learning by watching his actions. So if you can picture that, okay, so they're out here in the community. Jesus is doing the talking. They're observing. They're listening. They're following instruction. They're learning. Like I said, this is hands-on training. Okay, they didn't go to seminary or to a synagogue or to a, online Bible school. They were right there with it, and they were learning as they went. And then in the evening, as I mentioned earlier, this was probably the most intense, when the most intense learning happened. It was after the crowds went home. And it was just Jesus and the boys. And when it was just Jesus and the boys, this is when the questions started to be asked. Like here in public, Jesus often spoke in confusing riddles and parables. How many of you have read the parables of Jesus? I'm sure all of us have. And, probably with the exception of one or two, he explains it as he goes. But then it's for you to figure out. And it's always, he was a genius. I guess you could call Jesus a genius. But if you would think of him as a normal man, he was a genius in his way of thinking, because he could take something that was so relative at that moment or in those people's lives and turn it into something supernaturally significant and spiritual. That was the amazing thing that he could do with parables. And so he would speak the parables, and then in the evening, the disciples would ask, well, what do you mean by that? You know, I mean, what's the actual meaning of it? And that would be me. Okay, I can imagine myself, hey, you know, I was following along until you got to this point, and then, so what does that mean? And so Jesus would then explain the deeper spiritual meanings to his students. Okay, and so then they would get it, and I'm sure that they were all sitting around, oh man, yeah, finally got that. But it was also in the evening when they were alone that he would regularly rebuke them because of their lack of faith, their lack of understanding, their arguments over who was going to be better or who was going to be the greatest, their attitude toward outsiders. You know, I think it would be cool just to take each disciple individually and just do a background check on their life, where they came from. Simon the Zealot is one of the most, to me, is one of the most, he's very curious to me. Simon the Zealot, if you go by the portrayal that they did on The Chosen of Simon the Zealot, he was basically a mercenary. He was trained to be an assassin. But he found Jesus, and he got saved, and he turned his life around. But somewhere within that group, there had to be someone, I think, with that type of training and that type of attitude in order to look after the rest. But anyway, he was a very interesting character. And so, yeah, the disciples definitely did. And that's what they were looking for. And that's what it's like. I don't know. I've had conversations with ministers, with pastors, and wannabe ministers and pastors that never mention that. You know, when they were looking for a Messiah, they were looking for a revolutionist. They were looking for someone who would come in with the courage and the intelligence to overthrow the Roman government. That's what they were looking for. That's what they were looking for in a Savior. And it's just that Jesus was that, but he wasn't going to do it in the way that they thought he was going to do it. And that's God. And we could put that lesson and apply it to everything in our life. You know, we want God to do things, or we think that God will do things a certain way in our life, but it seems like, and speaking from experience, 8 times out of 10, and I'm being lenient, it don't happen that way.
Let somebody hurt us.
Yeah.
We got a plan now to get back in them, to get God instead of
Yeah. I mean, have you ever just laid it out on paper? You got this plan to do this, whether it be in finances or your business or whatever the case, and you're laying it all out. You got it down on paper, and that's kind of like what I do. If I put it on paper, I can remember it. Okay, I can weigh it all out. I can go back and check, you know, my balances and what have you, and think, man, this is the way to do it. No, got to take that out. That's not going to work. And then you go and you get this solid rock plan of how that you're going to achieve these goals. And then seems like the first dash out of the box, something goes south. And it's like, whoop, I didn't include God in on this. You know, and then if we don't include God in on that, it's not gonna work. It may seem like it is going to, but it's not going to work. But it's kind of like this. I know people who love the Lord, and I know people who are financially blessed, but I also know that some of those people don't give a penny of tithe. They don't pay their tithe due to the fact that they've never been in the place where they were in need. Are y'all following me? And it was like, I've talked to people like this. I said, do you have any idea how blessed that you would be if you would pay honor to God off of what he has blessed you with? And he said, well, you're just wanting our money. I said, no. I said, that's wrong. I want you to be blessed. I said, pay your tithe to another church. I don't care. I said, you don't understand what tithe is and what tithe means to me. That tithe is cursed. That's how come when it comes into the church, you better believe we're handling it correctly. So anyway, that's another story. But so evening was a very it was a very sacred time. It was it was probably the most intense, but I believe it was probably the most powerful. You know, even within seeing miracles that took place during the day and conversations that he had and the way that he handled people, it was when they came back and they gathered around the campfire and then they would talk about the day. I was really impressed, like with my youngest son and his family, because when I'm out there with them and we have dinner at night, everybody sits at the dinner table. There's no phones, no nothing. I said, thank you, Jesus. And we're all sitting at the dinner table and it's family time. And as we're sitting there, and once we've said grace, once the meal is served and during the meal, then Carrie would ask the girls, okay, we're going to start over here and tell us what was your high and what was your low for the day. And it begins a conversation. And well, this was the best part of my day, and I guess this would be the worst part of my day. But it's a way to get your kids to converse. It's a way that you can have family time together, and it's a simple question. And one of the things that I like about it is that you're telling your kids by asking them this, that your day is important to me. I want to know what made you happy. I want to know what made you sad. I want to know if you had a good day or a bad day. And it's just a way to open it up for family to have communication. It's a good thing. And I think that in the evening, it was their family. And, you know, along with them asking questions basically about what Jesus did, the parables, explain it to us a little bit better where we can understand it. And he would do that because he was the teacher, but he was also a disciplinarian. And he said, these are the things that, you know, that you shouldn't do. This is the way that you can do this better. And so I think that's a pretty cool thing. So another thing we can look at is just very common. What did they eat? We talked about whenever they had no food that they'd walk by the wheat fields and they would grab the wheat and crunch it up and eat it by the handfuls. That's kind of like a snack. But so they were constantly traveling. Their meals depended a lot upon people, and they foraged. And so therefore, how many of y'all would consider yourself a forager? You would? That is something that I would really love to learn. I mean, seriously. Because we have so many plants here in Arkansas, especially this time of the year, that are edible for municipal purposes and all of this kind of stuff. Now, Joyce, Deanna's mom, she was kind of into that. She could tell you just about what any kind of plant was, what it was good for. Oh, don't touch that or whatever. You know, there's something, you know about milkweed?
I haven't learned on that yet.
Okay. Here again, being me, y'all know what a milkweed is? Okay. It's a weed, and it's a broadleaf weed. It grows everywhere around here. Yeah. No, it will. It has the potential to make you. Anyway, there's some characteristics to it that are good and bad. But whenever if you break the stalk, and if I remember correctly, the stalk is kind of like a U shape, like a piece of celery. Okay. And if you break that, like when it goes down, it kind of looks like that, and then it goes up and about as thick as your finger. But anyway, if you break them over, which are tender, I think you can actually cook them. But when you break it open, then there is actually a fluid in it, a liquid that's white, and it looks like milk. That's why they call it a milkweed. So now you know me. If I'm going to taste dog food, I'm going to taste like that. And that was the most horrible stuff I ever put in my mouth. It was terrible. And I'll agree with you. If you ever ate it, it'd probably kill you. Man, it took me forever to get that taste out of my mouth. But anyway. Poke salad. Yeah. Yeah. And my mom used to have us go out when we went, you know where Sandals at? You know the old saddle store that they just redone? Well, my aunt and uncle lived there for years and years and years ago. And when the old mill was there, right in front of the saddle store, this is where my dad was raised. Right in the middle of the saddle store, there's a road that goes up to the left and it crosses the bridge, and the mill's on the right hand side or left hand side. And when you went up on top of that hill was the old home place. And we would drive out there, and we rode in the back of a 54 Plymouth in the trunk. Yeah, us kids. And that's when 289 was gravel. So they dropped us off at the creek. You can only imagine, because you could only see the whites of our eyes because of the dust that come in the trunk. And so they would dump us off at the creek and say, go jump in, clean yourself off before you come up to the house. And then it got to be a standing rule that whenever we would go to the mill and go swimming to basically take a bath, that we had to pick watercress. And the watercress, grew along the edges. And so all of us kids would bring home 2 or 3 big handfuls of watercress, and my great grandma would cook it. And it was greens, I guess. I don't know what you'd call it. But I didn't like any of that stuff. I didn't like poke salad. I didn't like watercress. I didn't like any of it. And, it's a big broadleaf. You see it growing everywhere, but it's kind of like, it's a hillbilly cabbage.
Well, then I wouldn't eat it.
Like spinach.
I would.
Yeah.
It's a vegetable. I'm not going to eat it.
Yeah.
It's really disgusting.
You ain't got to cook right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Little bacon grease. Yes, sir.
Bacon grease, you bet. Put the bacon grease in there and you boil it up and eat it, and oh, you'll love it. However,
there's a class at the University of Wyoming, our daughter Tiffany took it when she was supposed to be an RN. And she could name every plant all over the mountains or anywhere she could get out and actually survive for months and months and months just on the plants of the land.
yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I'd like to learn about that. Because it's like with berries. You see lots of berries that are growing. I have a tree that has produced all of these stinking grape-looking berries, and it's the first time, and they have been dropping all over my vehicles and my shed. And it's like, it seems like this is the first time that it's done it. Like there were years where it was dormant. It didn't produce anything, but this year it's just an overabundance. And birds eat them. My dogs eat them. But, anyway. But there are some berries that may taste good, but they're not good for you. They'll give you acid reflux. They're basically a poison. And so you got to know the difference. And there are some berries that, especially I learned this when I was in Canada, is that there's 2 types of berries up there that grow in these little bushes. And this is one of the main diets of the bears. Those bears eat those berries. And, but anyway, you have to know the difference between the 2, and you have to eat them when they're at a certain color. Because if you don't, then you're going to get cramps, you'll get diarrhea, and it can put you in a hospital. So, and there have been known people dying from them from eating too many of them. But they are identical in size and shape and color and everything, and you have to look at the leaf of the bush to tell what type of berry that it is. And so it's just stuff like that. So to me, just play it safe. I just don't touch any of them. But it would be good to know that, you know. Hopefully none of us will ever have to, but it would be good knowledge. What is? Yeah. Yeah. I've known, do you ever eat the purple clover? That's pretty good. Yeah. The purple. Huh? Thistle? Yeah.
It has all the stickery things, yeah.
Yeah. I haven't ever tried that.
You have to come over for supper.
You're here serving poke salad. I'm going to pass. Oh, gosh. All right. So they foraged a lot. And, of course, you know, the majority of these guys were fishermen. And so I'm sure that they could catch fish. And they were always by the water. And they ate the coarse barley bread. And that was very common. Okay. And the coarse, and maybe Michelle can help us out on that, but I'm assuming that the coarse bread was made up of a coarser type of wheat. I'm not sure where they got their flour from. I mean, I'm sure that there was a lot of wheat flour, but but it was like barley. Yeah. 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 So, and it was barley loaves that they fed the 5,000. So, yeah. So, as I mentioned, was kind of funny to me because they were fishermen, and there's thousands of ways to fix fish, is what somebody told me once. I said, no, there's not either. there's two in my book, and that's about it. But dried, salted, or roasted fish. Now, I've done the roasted fish to where you just you catch the fish, put it over an open fire. I mean, I guess that's roasted to me. And it's not so bad, because actually, if you eat fish the way that most people ate fish, you're just supposed to eat sushi. Because the way that we look at fish, what you're tasting in fish is the batter. Let's just say it's catfish, okay? What you're tasting when you eat catfish is the batter, and that's what gives it the flavor. How many of you like real fishy fish? Yeah. I don't care for fishy fish personally, and I'm not a sea. I don't eat anything out of the ocean.
I like grilled salmon. So
Yeah.
when I think of what they did, I think, well, it must have been kind of like grilled salmon.
Yeah.
If they did it over and over.
Yeah.
But that wouldn't dry a fish.
Huh?
That wouldn't dry a fish. They didn't have dehydrated.
They hung them, smoked them like in a smokehouse maybe, or yeah. I mean, basically it's fish jerky. And, you know, and if you know, now I like salt. That's one of my bad things, is I salt everything. I even salt watermelon and cantaloupe. I've always liked salt on that. But anyway, I could probably do the dried salted, but anyway, I don't know about the other. But getting back to this is what they had an abundance of. So I won't say an abundance, but it was there. And then, of course, them being fishermen, I'm sure that they were, you know, they knew how to do it, and they could fix it in several different ways. But what I had read, that it was easily preserved because it's a light meat, and it lasts a long time. There were one thing that I read to where that they prepared one of them is that they would catch the fish and they would leave the skin on it. And I don't know what kind of fish this is, but they would debone it and then they would smash it. And then they would dry it out. But they left the skin on one side of it. And now it didn't last as long as the salted or the fish that are hung and dried out. And then on the road, they picked wild olives, which there was, of course, you're talking about Israel and Jerusalem and Galilee. There was a lot of olive trees and olive orchards, figs, grapes, pomegranates. There's a lot of people that I know like pomegranates. Don't care for them too much myself, but well, yeah, it was pretty much the same. Yeah, kind of tropical weather. No, but there was also seasons. Okay, there were seasons, because there were harvest seasons and planting seasons and things like that. So, but I'm sure as a way that God made even here, there were things that were edible during every season. So you just had to know which ones.
Did they have rabbits over there?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm pretty sure that they probably had a lot of camel meat. You don't hear too much about horses because only the rich had horses. That's how come, like when you read in the Bible that it was donkeys, mules, but they were used for two different things. Actually, very seldom were they really used for transportation, but they were used for hauling, if you will. The smaller mules, the burros. Mary rode on one of them, but their basic task or their basic usage was hauling water or grain or something like. They were work animals. And so camels came along, and camels and horses belonged to the rich, the upper echelon. It was difficult for someone, say like for these guys, maybe not Peter, but to own them actually. But a lot of goats, they ate a lot of goat meat. They had cows, but cows back then were, lamb. And, during Passover, they slaughtered literally thousands of lambs. And this is what we would consider kind of like veal, beef, but veal is from a calf. And so I'm not real sure. I know that they would slaughter them. They bled them. They let them bleed out. I know a lot of the skins that they used. And another thing is that when it can't come to animals, they did not waste anything. There was they used every part of the animal for something. There was nothing that went to waste. I remember when I was a kid that we lived right behind my grandma and grandpa, and I remember going down to the mailbox or to the post office and with my grandpa, and we picked up all these boxes of little chicks. He ordered them through the mail, and we'd go down to the post office and we picked a truckload of them, and then he had them put them in the shed, and he put sawdust in there for the floor and everything, and he'd raise up fryers. And then they would come a time to where it was time to go out and kill the chickens. And so they had this big cauldron, this big cast iron pot out there. They built a fire under it, boiling water. And my grandma was the best chicken ringer, necker, or whatever you call it I'd ever seen in my life. And she would get out there, and we were just kids. And I don't know how old I was. I might have been 6 or 7 years old when we was doing this. But she was out there, and she'd grab 2 chickens, pow! And we had 10, 15 chickens running around in the backyard, our front yard, with no heads. And then we'd run over. She said, well, catch that and get that and throw him in that pot. Throw him in that pot. And so we'd catch them and throw them in there and they'd boil them. Then we'd pluck them and skin them out. And she said, come here and let me show you how to wring a neck. And so she was showing me. And I tried to wring that chicken's neck. And that chicken we didn't have to worry about plucking him because he didn't have a feather on him by the time I got done with him. I mean, he's running around there with no feathers from his wings all the way up to his head because I never could pop his neck. Anyway, but then we had that going on. And then over on the other side of the house, my dad and my grandpa would butcher the pig. And so I don't remember everything of what they did, but my grandma, I remember her going over there. And I had no idea that a pig had that much intestines. And she saved those intestines and done something with them. I don't know if she made lard out of them or chitlins. Okay.
For sausage casings.
Yeah, but she kept them. And anyway, it was an experience.
Pigs are the nastiest meat to eat. They carry parasites, excuse me not. Google it, study on it.
What does?
Pigs.
Pigs?
Yes. Parasites.
Well, that's how come you deep fry.
You
Yeah.
don't eat pork?
I do sausage. We don't buy pork roast, pork steak, pork loin, nothing.
Yeah.
We don't buy it. It's
Chicken.
Yeah.
They raise it.
Yeah, their pork loins got names.
what's that now?
Do we feed them the best of food?
Yeah. No chemicals, no antibiotics, no
Well,
nothing.
think about pork. What do they do? They wallow in their chest, in their junk, and
You're gonna have to come over.
You should come over.
Yeah, get you some of that pork and greens. Well, how many of y'all like pomegranates? Yeah? Yeah. I guess are there good pomegranates and bad pomegranates? Never had a bad one? I never even thought of a pomegranate till I married my wife, and then she ate them. Anyway, I didn't care for them. Figs, like dried figs. I don't care about them either. I've ate them, but I didn't. But anyway, here again, that it mentioned in some of the things that I read, this going out and grabbing the wheat stalks, and then rubbing them together was a very common thing. So they would do that a lot. So that's kind of basically some of the things that they ate. I mean, and here again, they were by the Mediterranean Sea. So they would get, and a lot of this fish that they got would come from salt water on the Mediterranean, but the Galilee was freshwater. And so there were different types of fish that they would catch and everything. But the point that I want to make here is that the disciples and Jesus, due to the fact that they walked along the Mediterranean and they would catch those fish and dry them out, and that was some of their main food, that they were doing the Mediterranean diet long before it was popular. Just saying. Oh, gosh. Okay. In the evening, hospital hosts would serve them this thick porridge or stews, lentils, beans, onions, and garlic. Now, I could probably do that right there. It's basically a pea and bean soup, and onions and garlic would give it some flavor. Now y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but if it's a stew, then it's got some kind of meat in it. Okay. Huh?
Lentils replace meat, very protein.
Okay. Okay.
I'm allergic to lentils, so.
Okay.
One time I ate once, and it was first who gets shot. Bad.
Okay, so how do you make that, how would you make that thick?
You smash the beans up and it naturally thickens it.
Okay, okay. So I'm assuming if there was any meat in it, it's probably going to be lamb or goat. Most probably 9 times out of 10, it'd probably be goat because there were plenty of goats, and they did eat goat. Any of y'all ate goat? Goat's pretty good. I've ate a bunch of goat, especially when I was in Africa and Uganda. That's about all they had, or where I was at. They served chicken when I was over there, but they cut their chicken up a lot different than we do. And so it's difficult to identify which piece of chicken that you're eating. You can tell dark meat from white meat, which I never touched. I know that the chicken had white meat, right? Every chicken has white meat. And the whole time that I was over 3 weeks at one time, and never once of all the times that I ate chicken did I get a piece of white meat. So anyway, I guess that's for the rich and famous. I don't know. And of course, water, that was their main drink. They did have what they considered cheap, diluted sour wine during meals. And I would just soon drink water. But yeah. So you can see here their diet that they had. That was, it's kind of like, it's really good that Geraldine brought out some good points about the protein, because a lot of the things that they eat, I mean, it seems like they were, you got to have protein. Somewhere in there, you got to have protein. But notice there's nothing, as far as drink, 99% was water. And I can tell y'all basically from experience that a lot of their water that they drank wasn't just really good water. You had to acquire, your body had to develop, what am I looking at? The water had a lot of bacteria in it. Yeah. And so your body had to adapt to that. And so anyway, notice that there is not any sugar.
I'm not going.
But anyway, all right. So what did they wear? Jesus told them in the very beginning, he said, God travel light. Don't take an extra tunic. Don't take any extra baggage. They wore the standard clothing for that time. Now, watch this, how these tunics are made and what they're made of. They're made of wool, basic knee length or ankle length garment, as we saw in the picture. They were woven wool or linen. Now, there was more woven wool than linen. Linen was definitely be more comfortable because there was no undergarments. You wore this right against your body. So if you've ever wore wool and put it against your skin, it's a little rough. It's a lot hot. It's not comfortable, but most of the time, this is the way that they what they wore. Sleeveless or short sleeve, and as it mentioned there, is worn directly against the skin. So I like linen, but linen within it, you hardly anybody wear linen, or have you wore linen? I like it. It's okay, but it's not something that's popular. Wool, and this is woven wool. This is not yarned wool. This is woven wool. And so it's thicker. And so it would be really scratchy. And you can only imagine in that type of heat, you're sweating. Anyway, yeah. All right. This is something else that they all had was a belt. Sometimes it was leather, and for me, I would be wearing a leather belt because leather can be used for other things. Leather belt can also be used to sharpen tools or knives or things of that nature. They either had a leather belt or a cloth sash. They tied it around their waist. And whenever they were walking long distances, they would pull the bottom of the tunic up, as I said there. They tuck it into the belt to allow their legs to move freely. It was also made it a little bit cooler. And that was known as girding your loins. So they needed that belt in order to pull their tunic up where they could tuck it in their belt. This is a way that they could also they could run if they needed to. But anyway, and then they had their cloak. This was very heavy. A lot of times they were made from wool. And as it mentions there, I think this was their most valuable possession, serving as a coat against the wind and rain by day and a blanket by night. Likely featured fringes or tassels on their corners, keeping within a Jewish tradition. And so that was something that was very important. That was one piece of clothing that was probably the most valuable to them. And you'll see a lot, if you see some depictions or some pictures, you might see them with just the tunic on, and where it's down to, maybe halfway down their calf, I guess. And then they would have this, looks like a blanket rolled up around their neck. Well, that's their tunic. So their footwear was just very simple leather sandals. A thick sole and leather thongs, and that was it. So I just wanted to get into this just for your information because I've always thought, and then we're going to end up with something a little bit different. But so how did they die? According to Christian tradition and historical records, almost all of Jesus' original disciples died as martyrs, refusing to renounce their faith under severe persecution. Only 2 of their deaths are officially documented in the Bible, and that's James and Judas Iscariot. The fates of the others are recorded in early historians like Eusebius or Josephus, and the rest is recorded in local church traditions, especially through the Catholic Church. So here's how they died, and we're just going to go through this kind of quick. Judas Iscariot, of course, we know how that he died. He went out and he hung himself. He was stricken with guilt after betraying Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, returned the money to the temple, and then he went out and hanged himself just outside of Jerusalem. James, the son of Zebedee, was beheaded. And notice the date, it was 44 years after the death of Jesus. He was the first one to be martyred, first of the 12. And the book of Acts records that King Herod Agrippa had him executed with a sword, and then during an early wave of the church persecution in Jerusalem. And the rest, those are the only 2 in the Bible that's recorded of how they died. And then the rest is from historical events and church tradition. Simon Peter was crucified upside down, sentenced to death in Rome under Emperor Nero. Early historical sources, including Clement of Rome, state that he requested to be crucified upside down because he felt unworthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. I think that's very noble. John is the only one who died of natural causes. And he died at an older age. However, he did survive. There was an attempt on his life, and they actually boiled him in oil. They put him in the pot of oil to boil him, to kill him, and the Lord Jesus saved him. And he was exiled then to a prison on the island of Patmos, and that's where he wrote the book of Revelations. And then after that, he died in Ephesus, and he had died of old age. And so, and by the way, we'll talk about this a little bit earlier. John, who wrote the book of Revelations in 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and John, was the youngest of the disciples. And we'll talk about that here in a minute.
I believe that was Jesus' favorite disciple.
You think?
I believe so.
Well, I know that he was the only one who laid his head on Jesus' chest.
I think John writes the one who he
Yeah, yeah. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross. He traveled to Greece and was bound, and rather than nailed to an X-shaped cross, he reportedly survived for 2 days, preaching to the crowds from the cross before dying. Wow. The Book of Martyrs, if you're familiar with that, it's been around for years and years, but it talks about how that they died, goes into greater detail. And some of the, I'm being pretty light right now, but it gets into some of the really gory details. They died brutal deaths. And then there's Thomas. He was speared to death. He traveled the furthest east, establishing the first Christian communities in South India. He was pierced through with a spear by local soldiers while praying on a hill. Bartholomew and Nathaniel, skinned alive, preached in Armenia, where his success angered the local pagan authorities. He was flayed, skinned alive, and then, still alive, beheaded. You can only imagine the torture that he went through. Matthew or Levi ministered to communities in Persia, North Africa, and tradition from the Catholic theme notes he was beheaded or hacked to death in Ethiopia after criticizing a local king. Philip, crucified or stoned. He preached in Turkey, modern-day Turkey, Hierapolis, where he was arrested by a Roman proconsul and crucified or stoned to death. James, son of Alphaeus, this would be James the Less. He was beaten, stoned, thrown from a pinnacle of a temple. Now watch this, in Jerusalem. He survived the fall and then was subsequently stoned and beaten to death with clubs. A day in the life. Simon the Zealot and Jude, which is known as also Thaddeus. Two evangelized together in Persia, modern day Iran. Now watch where these places are. Simon was reportedly sawn in half while Jude was killed with an axe, a halberd. A halberd is a very wide bladed axe. Matthias, stoned and beheaded. He was the replacement disciple after Judas' death, was eventually captured, stoned, and beheaded in Syria or possibly Jerusalem. So,
I believe that
yeah. It's,
it will get good back to that probably. If you are led to live after Jesus comes, those that stay, that don't take the mark, you will die.
Yeah.
Well, and in Fox, the martyrs, the disciples, they weren't the only ones that all this happened to. I mean, it was just
Oh, yeah.
regular believers.
Yeah.
They weren't the only ones that died that way.
Mm.
Regular, just.
You know, look at Stephen, how that he was actually, according to Scripture, was actually the first martyr for Christ, and he was a deacon. But we're basically focused in on the 12. But you know, he was stoned to death. I think I shared with y'all the tradition that they have in Iran and Iraq, the Middle East. Their marriage arrangements, the Sharia law thing, all of their beliefs are, in my opinion, so twisted that it's nothing. If you would study that and read some of that, it's just like, I mean, the devil himself is in the middle of it. They would, if a man got tired of his wife, he would accuse her of adultery. And I watched this one documentary to where this guy wanted to get rid of his wife, and he accused her of having an affair with his brother and paid his brother to admit to having an affair because nothing would happen to a man, but it was all about the woman. So, but not only did he, but she would be killed, and she was stoned to death. And this was like in the 80s, late 80s. And the way that they did that was that they take her out into a yard, and this was in between two buildings, and they dug a hole, and the only thing that was visible or above the ground was her head. And then all of the men, including the young boys, all of the males, would come out and throw rocks at her, and they would stone her to death. Yeah, it is. It is horrible. Yeah. 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 And it is horrible. The whole thing. The whole thing. It's just, their whole belief system to me is just out of, just crazy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. We were at our men's meeting last night. We were, which was a really good Bible study, but talking about Moses and how that Moses never got to enter the promised land. We talked about Miriam, and Miriam was the sister to Moses. And then, you know, when they crossed the Red Sea, Scripture has what they title as Miriam's song, where she was giving praise to God for, you know, delivering them from the Egyptian or from Pharaoh. But then it was like, due to the fact of her disobedience later on, that God turned her into a leper, and she died leprous. Aaron, who was the high priest, because of his disobedience, he never got to enter the promised land. Moses, due to the fact of his encounter with taking the staff and striking the stone of water, when God said to speak to it, walked in disobedience, and he never got to enter the promised land. The Levites, the tribe of Levites, had no inheritance. And so you're looking at all of these people who, for those 40 years, was the main characters and the leaders of this millions of people, if you will. But due to the fact of and then it talks about, and y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but it was saying, this point that I want to make, it also said that every person 20 years and older will not enter the promised land. And so you had all of the elite, and then you had all of these, and my thought was that, remember there was 40 years in the desert, 40 years in the wilderness? And then he said everyone 20 years and older will not come into the promised land. That generation, I believe God was showing grace on the 19-year-olds and down. he was showing grace because the only influence they had was that of the older people, because living in the wilderness or in the desert or in the wilderness, that's all they knew. They were born there. They were born in that. And so, but just remember, there's something to this, is that every one of the Jews who went into the promised land were teenagers. No one 20 and over didn't get to go in. So 19 and under. Joshua and Caleb did. Yes. Joshua and Caleb did. But the rest were 19 and over. Joshua and Caleb. Remember that. Thank you for reminding me.
God told Joshua, if I'm correct, that God told them they were stiff-necked people. And he said that they would come out, and that, correct me if I'm wrong, that when they came out, if they did not obey God, they would do the same thing. And what did they do? They also did the same thing their ancestors did.
Mm-hmm.
They got out to the promised land, and they did the same thing. They disobeyed.
Mm-hmm.
It goes from history to history, to judges to judges to judges. And here's where we are today.
Yeah.
2026. There's still wars.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing has changed. Jesus is coming.
History repeats itself.
History repeats.
Yep.
He does this with families, with friendships, generations, curses to curses.
Okay. Well, remember that Joshua and Caleb and probably 500,000 teenagers got to the promised land. Just keep that in mind, okay? All right. Now let's look at how old they were, just for real quick. Judas Iscariot was probably in his early 20s, assuming he was a young adult when he followed Jesus. He died by suicide in 33 AD. And just days after the betrayal, he was likely the youngest of the group to die. James, son of Zebedee, late 20s to mid 30s. He was old enough to work with his father as a full-time fisherman. When called, he was executed by King Herod Agrippa, and making him the first apostle to be martyred, likely while still a young man in his 30s. Okay? So I want you to catch these ages. And how old was Jesus when he was crucified? Okay? Now, the majority of the apostles traveled the world for 20 to 40 years. This is the rest of them. And after the resurrection, and meeting their deaths between the ages of 60 AD and 80 AD. So Simon Peter was most likely in his mid-60s. Peter was married and established when Jesus called him, making him one of the oldest disciples. He was crucified in Rome during Nero's persecution, as we mentioned. Roman Catholic archaeological excavations at the Vatican unearthed bones attributed to Peter. Forensic tests showed that they belonged to a robust man between the ages of 60 and 70 years old. So Peter died in his mid-60s. However, Peter was older. He was the oldest among them. Andrew, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, Philip, Matthias, Simon the Zealot, and Jude. Church tradition places the martyrdoms of these remaining men in their late 60s and 70s. And assuming they were in their late teens or early 20s during Jesus' ministry. Now, I want you to think about, keep this in mind. They were teenagers, okay? The majority, okay, well, I'll get to that. So they were late teens or early 20s during Jesus' ministry, all around 30 AD. They would have been in their 50s and 60s or early 70s when they were killed. So it all makes sense to me. You do the math. They would have been teenagers. John the Beloved was actually believed when he started to follow Jesus was between the ages of 15 and 18. Well, I guess I should have waited. John is widely believed to have been the youngest disciple, possibly only 15 to 18 years old when he met Jesus. He was the only one to escape martyrdom and die of natural causes in Ephesus around 100 AD. That means that he would have lived to be an elderly man in his late 80s and possibly in his 90s. All right? So, here's the thing. And I don't know what this might have in common. But Jesus and Peter were probably close to about the same age. So it would be Jesus and Peter and a handful of teenage boys that went out and turned the world upside down for Jesus, or for God. You go back to where God, through Moses, delivered the Israelites out of bondage and out of slavery. And so they're on their way to the promised land. And who got to enter the promised land? Jacob and Caleb and 500,000 teenagers. Yeah, Joshua and Caleb and 500,000 teenagers.
Can you imagine a bunch of immature teenagers?
Hmm?
Can you imagine a bunch of immature teenagers?
Oh my goodness.
Can I just
Say
say
yes,
this?
Jesus, they're immature. They're just getting there.
Yeah.
There is hope. Because I talked to my daughter, Pepper, today. They went on a mission trip last week and they took like 15 teenagers. And she said, she said, I was just amazed at how those kids could just up the cup when they were evangelizing, they were talking to people. She said, they could talk to those people and they could pull those scriptures up out from the inside of them and apply them to whatever daily question, whatever that those people had. She said, I was just absolutely amazed. And they're just young teenagers. I'm talking 15, 16. I'm not talking 18 and 19. I'm talking 15 and 16-year-olds. And she said, she said, I was just blown away by those kids. She said, I know it was the Lord. She said, I said, Lord, it's everything that's been sown into them.
Yeah.
The word has been sown into them. She said, I'm 45 years old. And she said, and I don't think I can do that.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But it was the teenagers. It's the young teenagers that are coming up. They are.
Yeah.
If you think about teenagers, and I can kind of see why maybe Jesus wanted to hang out with the teenagers too. They weren't old enough to be jaded by life and figure out their own bad habits and opinions and have lived life. If they're 15, you catch them while they're young and train them up good instead.
Remember the great impact that Charlie Kirk had going to schools, universities with the kids?
Yes.
To ask questions, and someone killed them, and I don't know that anything's doing that anymore.
Yeah.
I believe a revival is going to happen in America. Revival needs to happen.
There was a couple of things that kind of stood out when I was doing some research on this. I was interested in how old they were during that time, and then to discover that with the exception of Peter, they were probably all very young teenagers. Now, there is something that's called whenever a Jewish boy reached the age of 13, it was between the ages of 13 and 15 is when a Jewish boy, which they were actually considered men, young men, that was at the age where they would seek out a rabbi to study under. And so that's one point. But here's the other, is there was a temple tax. And then you had to pay your taxes. And Jesus and Peter are the only two who paid a Capernaum temple tax. Under Jewish law, the tax was only mandatory for males aged 20 and older. And Jesus and Peter were the only ones that were recorded of paying taxes. And so the other guys, the other 11 didn't. So that would also state that they were under the age of 20. And so, and we know that through other sources, tradition and history, that John was no doubt the youngest, and he was actually believed, they say, because they're being fair, because they don't know the exact days due to the fact that Jewish calendar and our calendars are different, and some things have changed throughout the years, and then we added in the leap year thing and all that. But anyway, they're within 2 or 3 years, okay? But anyway, it was believed that with John being the youngest, that he was probably 15 years old. If you will recall the things that David did when David killed a lion and bear, he was 14, 15 years old. And he was about that age whenever he went out and fought Goliath. But you know, at the age of 12, during biblical times, the age of 12 was the age of accountability. So you were considered a young man when you became a teenager. And then you learned man things from that point on. And you were treated as such from that point on. So it's amazing to me to think, and then after we did that Bible study last night with the guys, and the Lord is just showing me that I got a lot of stuff out of the Bible study last night that I hadn't seen before. But I know that there's definitely something to it, because these are two major turns in the Bible. When the Jews were freed from slavery, from the Egyptians, crossed the Red Sea, and then came into the Promised Land. When they came into the Promised Land, that was a huge turnaround. That was something that was a fulfillment of not just prophecy, but a promise that God would give them that particular land, because they belonged to, that's what he promised their ancestors, Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac. So that was a fulfillment of all that. And then when we look here at, of course, Jesus, and we know how things changed after his death and crucifixion, resurrection. But then to grab them young boys like that, or those young men, I don't really know what the connection is, but God's got a thing, it seems to me, in these major turnarounds. And then if you ever studied the revivals, historical revivals, the Great Awakenings, they began with teenagers, almost every one of them. It started out with the teenagers. The teenagers got on fire for the Lord, and just, made history. And it's been that way it's been that way since the beginning. Absolutely. And I believe that teenagers are hungry for the supernatural. Mm-hmm. Anyway, we're done. Hope you got something out of that.